The cook smiled as she twirled between the empty tables. She invited a shy customer to dance without hesitation. She didn't know that behind the simplicity was a millionaire, and that invitation would change both their destinies forever. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you're watching us. Let's continue. Helen adjusted her apron for the 1,000th time that night, an automatic gesture that had been repeated for 20 years in the kitchen of Corner Flavor restaurant. The smell of golden garlic in olive oil filled the atmosphere while she conducted her particular orchestra of pots and seasonings with the precision of a conductor. At 55, she knew every inch of that space like the lines of her own palm. The neighborhood restaurant wasn't famous, wasn't in food guides, but maintained a loyal clientele that appreciated honest, well-prepared food. Helen was the invisible soul behind every dish that left through the kitchen door, though few knew her name. To most, she was just the cook, a constant and silent presence that guaranteed the perfect functioning of that machinery. On that June night, the air was different. The new waitress, Maria, had forgotten to put on the background music that normally accompanied dinners. The unusual silence allowed the sounds from the kitchen to echo more clearly through the dining room, the clinking of silverware, the bubbling of pots, the rhythmic cutting of knives on wooden boards. That's when he entered. The Tuesday customer, as Helen called him mentally. For months he had been coming, always at the same time, always alone. He would sit at the table near the window and order the daily special without even looking at the menu. Helen observed him, discreetly through the crack in the kitchen door, intrigued by his constant and solitary presence. "Miss," she heard his voice for the first time, addressing Maria, "could you please put on some music? Something that makes you want to smile." The waitress, caught by surprise, ran to the small sound system. After a few moments of hesitation, the soft notes of an old bolero filled the atmosphere. Helen recognized the melody instantly. It was Sabre Ami, one of her mother's favorites. Normally, Helen would never leave the kitchen during service, except for extreme necessity. But at that moment, she needed to get more napkins from the dining room cabinet, a deviation from her well-established routine. When she crossed the space between the tables, she felt it. His gaze. It wasn't just any gaze, one of those that pass by you without really seeing. It was a gaze that seemed to see beyond the stained apron and hands calloused by work. A gaze that recognized the person behind the function, that saw the woman beyond the cook. Helen felt her heart accelerate slightly, her hands sweating unusually. She was about to return to her sanctuary when something extraordinary happened. The man stood up in a fluid and elegant movement. Without saying a word, he extended his hand in her direction. Time seemed to freeze. The other customers, the tables, the restaurant itself, everything disappeared for an instant. Helen looked at that extended hand, then at his eyes. Brown, eyes that transmitted an inexplicable calm, a silent invitation. In her 20 years of work, Helen had never done something so impulsive. Her place was in the kitchen, among pots and seasonings, not in the dining room dancing with a stranger. But there was something in that moment, in that music, in that gaze, that made her take a step forward. When her hand touched his, she felt the unexpected softness of his touch. He led her delicately, as if they had rehearsed that dance 1,000 times before. For 3 minutes and 45 seconds, the exact duration of the song, they floated through the small space between the tables, oblivious to the surprised looks from other customers and staff. The dance ended as smoothly as it began, without words, without explanations. Helen returned to the kitchen with her heart beating in a different rhythm, her cheeks slightly flushed, a strange sensation of lightness in her chest. She resumed her post in front of the stove, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something she didn't yet fully understand, but that would make that ordinary Tuesday night transform into the beginning of an extraordinary story. A story that began with a bolero, a gaze, and an unexpected dance. The next morning, Helen woke up with a different sensation. While preparing her solitary breakfast in the small apartment she called home, her thoughts kept returning to the previous night. The notes of the bolero still echoed in her mind, as well as the memory of that soft touch on her hands. She arrived earlier at the restaurant, as she always did. The preparation routine was her particular ritual, organizing ingredients, checking inventory, planning the day's menu. But today each gesture carried a different weight, as if the world had subtly shifted on its axis. "Ms. Helen," Maria's voice interrupted her thoughts. The young waitress entered the kitchen with her eyes shining with excitement. "You won't believe what happened yesterday after you left." Helen tried to maintain her composure, pretending to be focused on preparing vegetables. "What happened, dear?" "That customer, the one from the dance, he stayed another hour after you left. He asked for paper and pen, wrote something for a long time. He left an envelope at the register before leaving." Helen's heart jumped, but her voice remained calm. "And what was in the envelope?" "I don't know, Miss Helen. Mr. Albert, the owner, kept it with him, but I heard him commenting something about an important proposal." The restaurant's routine followed its normal course that day, but Helen noticed different looks directed at her. The other employees whispered in corners, and even some regular customers seemed to observe her with more attention when she occasionally appeared in the dining room. At the end of the shift, when she was preparing to leave, Mr. Albert called her to his office. He was a practical man who rarely showed emotions, but today there was something different in his demeanor. "Helen, we need to talk about something important." He adjusted his glasses on his face, a nervous habit she knew well. "That customer from yesterday, he's not an ordinary customer." She sat down, feeling a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Albert continued, "He's Edward Mitchell, from the Mitchell Transportation family. Do you know them?" Helen shook her head negatively. She was never very connected to news about businessmen or economics. "Well, he left a proposal. He wants to finance an expansion of the restaurant with a specific condition, that you be the director of the new professional kitchen he wants to set up here." The world seemed to spin for a moment. Helen clasped her hands in her lap, trying to process the information. "But why?" "He wrote something interesting in the letter." Mr. Albert took a paper from the drawer. "He said he found here something he had been looking for a long time, authenticity, and that your dance demonstrated that genuine moments of magic still exist in the world." Helen felt her face burn. "Mr. Albert, I apologize for dancing during service. It won't happen again." The boss laughed for the first time in years. "Helen, you've worked here for 2 decades. You never took vacation, never arrived late, never complained about anything. If one dance brought an opportunity like this, maybe you should have danced sooner." But the proposal brought more than just a promotion. Edward wanted to create a professional training program, focused especially on women over 40 who dreamed of working in gastronomy. Helen would be not only chef, but mentor. "He gave us a week deadline to think about it," Mr. Albert concluded. "But Helen, be honest. Do you think you can handle it? It's a lot of responsibility, a lot of exposure." The question hung in the air. Helen looked at her hands, marked by decades of hard work. She remembered her mother, who had also been a cook and dreamed of having her own restaurant. She thought of all the women who, like her, had talent but never had an opportunity. "Mr. Albert," she finally responded, her voice firm as never before, "I think it's high time we found out what I'm capable of." As she left the restaurant that night, Helen looked at the starry sky of New York. The city seemed different, more alive, more full of possibilities. Somewhere a bolero was playing from a distant window, and she smiled, knowing that her life was about to change forever. One week transformed into a whirlwind of emotions and changes for Helen. Corner Flavor Restaurant buzzed with news of the future expansion, and she found herself at the center of attention she had never experienced before. Every employee, every regular customer, wanted to know more about the cook who had won the trust of one of the country's most influential men. The first official meeting with Edward Mitchell's team took place on a rainy Monday. Helen had spent the entire weekend choosing the appropriate outfit, opting for a navy blue ensemble that her sister had convinced her to buy years ago for a wedding. It seemed appropriate for meeting architects and business consultants. "Ms. Helen?" An elegant young woman in a gray suit with perfectly styled hair greeted her at the door. "I'm Beatrice Fields, Mr. Mitchell's assistant. He unfortunately cannot be present today, but he gave me specific instructions about the project. Helen's heart sank a little. Part of her hoped to see Edward again, to better understand the man behind that extraordinary proposal, but she maintained the professional posture that years in the kitchen had taught her. Always move forward, no matter what surprise appears. The pie. Meeting took place in the improvised room at the back of the restaurant. Architectural plans were unrolled on the table, presentations on laptops showed financial projections, and Helen found herself immersed in a completely new world of technical terms and spreadsheets. The initial project provides for complete renovation of the current space and incorporation of the building next door, Beatrice explained, pointing to the plans. The new professional kitchen will have capacity to receive up to 15 students per class in the training program. Helen observed everything with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. And how long will it take to start? Construction can begin in 2 weeks, one of the architects responded. But first we need to define some crucial details. Do you have a preference for any specific type of equipment? Any special arrangement for the kitchen? It was at that moment that Helen felt her confidence grow. There finally was something she knew deeply. She began talking about workflows, about the importance of ergonomics for older female cooks, about how every inch of counter space needed to be designed to optimize movements. The team was impressed with her practical knowledge. Beatrice was taking notes furiously on her tablet, while the architects adjusted their drawings based on Helen's suggestions. "There's one more thing," Beatrice commented at the end of the meeting. "Mr. Mitchell left this for you." She handed over an elegant envelope, sealed with wax. Helen opened it carefully, her hands slightly trembling. Inside there was only a card with a handwritten phrase: "The dance is just the beginning. Keep following the music of your heart." That night, after everyone had left, Helen stayed alone in the kitchen that would soon be transformed. She touched the old walls, the worn tiles, the stove that had been her companion for so many years. Silent tears ran down her face, not of sadness, but of an emotion she didn't know how to name. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Beatrice with the detailed construction schedule and a list of potential candidates for the first class of the training program. Women like her, who had spent years cooking in their homes in small establishments, dreaming of an opportunity that never seemed to come. Helen sat on her usual stool and began reading each story, each small biography. Maria, 52 years old, lunch, box cook. Josephine, 48 years old, independent pastry chef. Antonia, 63 years old, retiree with the dream of opening a boarding house. Each name carried a lifetime of postponed hopes. "We're going to make it happen," she whispered to herself, holding Edward's envelope close to her chest. "We're going to make each one of them shine." The construction began at a frantic pace that completely transformed Corner Flavor Restaurant's routine. To not completely interrupt the restaurant's operation, Helen improvised a temporary kitchen in a rented space nearby, where she continued preparing the dishes her customers loved so much. It was during this transition period that she began noticing changes in herself. Her reflection in the mirror showed a different woman, still the same Helen as always, but with a new brightness in her eyes, a more upright posture, a more frequent smile on her lips. "Miss Helen, the resumes for the first." "Class arrived," announced Maria, handing over a thick folder. The waitress had become her informal assistant during the entire process, demonstrating contagious enthusiasm for the project. There were more than 200 applicants, 200 women who, like her, kept dreams between pots and recipes. Helen spent entire nights reading each story, each presentation letter. Some were handwritten, others typed with evident difficulty. All touched her heart in a special way. "How are we going to choose only 15?" she asked herself aloud, looking at the photographs attached to the resumes. Smiling, shy, hopeful faces, each one telling a silent story of perseverance. That's when she had an idea. She took her phone and, breathing deeply, called Beatrice. "We need to talk to Mr. Mitchell," she said as soon as the assistant answered. "I have a different proposal for the project." The meeting was scheduled for the next day, But again, Edward didn't appear personally. Instead, a video conference was organized in the temporary office. Helen, who had never participated in a video call in her life, nervously adjusted her hair while the screen lit up. But the image that appeared wasn't Edward's. Only his voice filled the room while a neutral background occupied the screen. "Ms. Helen, it's a pleasure to finally talk. Beatrice told me you have an idea for the project." Swallowing her nervousness, Helen explained her plan. Instead of 15 students, she proposed a rotating system. The candidates would be divided into groups that would alternate between practical and theoretical classes. Some could start helping in the restaurant kitchen, others participating in specific workshops. "That would mean a bigger investment," Edward's voice sounded thoughtful. "And much more work for you." "Yes," Helen responded, firmly. "But it also means that none of them will be left behind. Each one will have her chance, even if it takes a little longer." There was a moment of silence on the line. Helen could hear her own heart beating rapidly. "Do you know why I chose to invest in your project, Miss Helen?" Edward's voice finally broke the silence. "Because that night when we danced, I saw something rare in your eyes, the ability to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. You just proved that I wasn't wrong." The project was approved on the spot with an expanded budget. Beatrice immediately began making calls, reorganizing schedules and contracts. Helen remained seated, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. "One more thing," Edward's voice added before ending the call. "Keep saving that bolero in your heart. Someday, who knows, we might dance again." The screen went dark, leaving Helen with a smile on her lips and tears in her eyes. Her phone began ringing insistently. It was the first candidates being contacted by Beatrice, overflowing with joy at the news that they had been accepted into the program. That night, alone in her apartment, Helen took an old dress from the closet. She put music on the small kitchen radio and for the first time in decades danced alone, celebrating not only her own transformation, but that of all the women who would soon become part of her life. The inauguration of the new space was approaching, and the old Corner Flavor restaurant had transformed into something far beyond initial expectations. The construction revealed a magnificently renovated building with large windows that allowed natural light to flood the environment. The professional kitchen was a realized dream, with state-of-the-art equipment harmoniously integrated with traditional elements that Helen had insisted on maintaining. "It's like a cathedral of gastronomy," whispered Mary, one of the first students, in the program, when entering the space for the first time. At 52 years old, she had left her job as a cook in a company to participate in the project. Helen smiled, sharing the enchantment. Every detail had been thought of with care, counters at different heights to accommodate people of all statures, special non-slip floors, perfectly distributed lighting. But what caught the most attention was the wall of Portuguese tiles that Helen had personally chosen, each one telling a different story through its delicate paintings. "Ms. Helen!" Maria burst through the kitchen door, agitated as always. "The reporter from Flavors and Wisdom magazine arrived for the interview." Helen's heart raced. The report had been Beatrice's idea, a way to publicize the project and attract more attention to the cause of women in gastronomy. But Helen had never given an interview in her life. The reporter, Amanda Torres, was an elegant woman in her 40s, with perceptive eyes and a gentle smile. "Ms. Helen, it's an honor to meet you personally. Your project is causing a real stir in the gastronomy world." During the following 2 hours, Helen found herself telling her story, not just about the current project, but about her 20 years of silent dedication to the kitchen. She spoke about her mother, about the old recipes she kept like treasures, about the dance that changed her life. "And what about Mr. Edward Mitchell?" asked Amanda, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Has he appeared to follow the project's development?" Helen hesitated for a moment. "Mr. Mitchell prefers to stay behind the scenes, but his presence is felt in every detail, in every dream he allows us to realize." The reporter paused, consulting her notes. "You know, I did extensive research on him before coming here. It's curious how he practically disappeared from public life in recent years. Some say that after a complicated family dispute, I prefer to focus on the good he's doing now," Helen gently interrupted. Sometimes people need to step away to find their true purpose. Amanda smiled, understanding. And what's the next step of the project? Tomorrow, we receive our first complete class, Helen responded, her face lighting up. 40 extraordinary women who will transform this space into something even more special. After the interview, Helen found a new envelope on her desk. Inside, besides the familiar card, with Edward's elegant handwriting, there was a pen drive. To inspire your first days of class, said the card. Some family recipes you might want to share. That night at home, Helen connected the pen drive to her newly acquired laptop. She found dozens of files, not just recipes, but old stories of American gastronomy, photographs of traditional dishes, almost forgotten techniques. It was a culinary treasure that made her eyes water. Among the files there was a folder marked Personal. Inside, a single photo. A young Edward Mitchell next to a grey-haired lady, both smiling in front of an old stove. The caption said simply, "Grandma, Mary, the first person who taught me that cooking is an act of love." Helen gently touched the screen, feeling that she was beginning to understand a little more about the mysterious man who had transformed her life. That photo revealed something that headlines and speculation could never capture, the true reason behind that entire project. The first day of class dawned with special energy in the air. Helen had arrived before sunrise, preparing every detail with the same care she dedicated to her most elaborate dishes. On each counter, a new apron with each student's name embroidered, a special gift she had secretly commissioned. The women began arriving one by one, each carrying not just their bags, but decades of postponed dreams. There was Mrs. Josephine, who had been selling cakes at fairs for 30 years, Sandra, who had raised 4 children cooking in family homes, Grace, who had abandoned gastronomy college in the 80s to care for her parents. "Welcome to your new home," Helen began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Here we are not just cooks, we are guardians of memories, creators of moments, artists of flavor." The inaugural class was about much more than culinary techniques. Helen shared some of the recipes she had found on Edward's pen drive, interweaving them with stories of her own journey. The students listened fascinated, recognizing in her words their own dreams and struggles. "Ms. Helen," called Grace during a break, "do you really think it's not too late for us?" The silence that followed was dense with expectation. Helen looked at each face present, seeing in them the same fear she had so often felt. "Let me tell you a story," she responded, taking one of the old books that Edward had shared. "Do you know Julia Child? She started her career in gastronomy at 37. At 49, she published her first book. At 51, she debuted on television." The women moved closer, absorbing every word. "But we don't need to go that far. Look at me. At 55, I thought my role was to remain backstage, invisible. Then a bolero began to play. At that moment, as if by magic, the soft notes of Sabre Ami filled the atmosphere. All heads turned to the kitchen door, where Maria was next to the small sound system, smiling. "Life is like a recipe," Helen continued, her voice mixing with the melody. "Sometimes we need to adjust the heat, change the ingredients, start from scratch. But never is it too late to create something extraordinary." The afternoon passed in the blink of an eye. The students learned the basic fundamentals of the professional kitchen, but more than that, they began forming bonds among themselves. Stories were shared between cutting vegetables and seasoning sauces. Laughter echoed through the bright corridors. At the end of the day, when everyone had left, Helen found a different envelope on her desk. It wasn't the elegant paper that Edward usually used, but rather a set of simple sheets, carefully folded. They were letters from the students. Each one had written a few lines about what that first day meant to them. The words overflowed with gratitude, hope, and determination. The last letter, however, made her heart stop for a moment. It was from Grace. "Dear Helen, today I understood that we are not just learning to cook, we are learning to dance with life again. Thank you for showing us that we can still dream." Helen kept the letters along with all the other treasures she had been collecting since that first night of dancing. In her apartment, while preparing tea before sleep, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered hesitantly. Helen. Edward's voice sounded clear for the first time, without the intermediation of video conferences. I just wanted to say that you exceeded all my expectations today. My grandmother would be proud. Before she could respond, the line went quiet. Helen stood there, holding the phone, a soft smile on her lips. Outside, the city pulsed with its nocturnal energy, but inside her heart a bolero continued playing softly. The report in Flavors and Wisdom magazine caused an impact that no one had predicted. What was supposed to be just an article about an innovative gastronomic training project transformed into a viral phenomenon on social networks. The story of the cook who danced a bolero and transformed her life, along with that of dozens of other women, captured the public's imagination. "Miss Helen, you need to see this," exclaimed Maria, running to the kitchen with her cell phone. "Our institutional video already has more than 1 million views, and the comments, they're so moving." Helen, who barely knew how to use WhatsApp, suddenly found herself at the center of a digital revolution. Women from all over the United States began sharing their own stories of postponed dreams, of talents hidden in their home kitchens. That's when Beatrice appeared with an unexpected proposal. "Helen, we received invitations from 3 television programs. They want to do special reports about the project." Helen's initial panic was quickly replaced by serene determination. If her story could inspire other women to pursue their dreams, then she would face the cameras. "But with one condition," she said, surprising everyone with her firmness. "I want some of our students to participate too. This story isn't just mine." The first recording took place on a Thursday morning. The television crew transformed the kitchen into an improvised studio, with lights and cameras everywhere. Helen chose 3 students to participate: Mrs. Josephine, with her award-winning cakes from fairs, Sandra, who now taught Brazilian cooking classes, and Grace, who had become the informal spokesperson for the class. "And how do you feel being called the fairy godmother of gastronomy?" asked the host, referring to the nickname the internet had given her. Helen laughed, adjusting her new apron, a gift from the students, embroidered with small musical notes. "I'm not a fairy godmother. I'm just someone who learned that it's never too late to take a new dance step." During the recording, the students demonstrated recipes, shared stories of overcoming obstacles, and talked about how the project had changed their lives. The host was visibly moved when Grace revealed that she had just opened her own catering business, specialized in events for seniors. Behind the scenes, however, something unusual was happening. Beatrice was receiving urgent messages on her cell phone, her face alternating between worry and relief. "Helen," she called during a break, "Mr. Mitchell is watching the live broadcast on the internet. He wants to talk to you." With her heart racing, Helen was taken to a private room, where a laptop was open on a video conference. For the first time since that night of dancing, she saw Edward Mitchell's face. He looked different from the elegant businessman who had danced with her. His hair had more grey strands, and his features seemed more tired, but his eyes still had that special brightness she had noticed that first night. "Helen," he said softly, "you transformed my dream into something much bigger than I could imagine." "Your dream?" she asked, intrigued. Edward smiled, a sad and sweet smile at the same time. "My grandmother, she was like your students, an extraordinary cook who never had her chance to shine. Before passing away, she made me promise to help other women like her, but I didn't know how until that night at the restaurant." Helen felt tears in her eyes. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because this story needed to be yours, not mine. You gave life to this project, Helen. You made it grow with your own heart." At that moment, someone knocked on the door. It was time to return to the recording. Helen hesitated, not wanting to end that rare moment. "Edward," she said, using his first name for the first time, "are you going to keep hiding?" He touched the screen softly, as if wanting to reach her. "Some dances need time to find their right rhythm, don't they?" The screen went dark, leaving Helen with 1,000 unasked questions and a heart beating in a rhythm she was beginning to recognize very well. The project's success brought not only recognition, but also unexpected challenges. With growing media exposure, The restaurant school became a pilgrimage point for aspiring chefs and curious people from all over the country. Registrations for new classes skyrocketed, reaching numbers no one had predicted. 3,000 applicants. Helen sighed, looking at the pile of forms on her desk. How are we going to handle so many people? It was Grace who had the idea that would change everything. During a meeting with the first graduates of the program, she timidly raised her hand. What if each of us took on a small class in our own kitchens, like a network of mentors? The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the door opening. Beatrice entered, carrying her inseparable tablet. Sorry to interrupt, but I think you'll want to see this. She projected on the wall a map of the United States, with small luminous dots scattered across all regions. Each dot represents a professional female cook over 40 who registered to be a mentor in our program. Some have their own restaurants, others work from their homes, all inspired by your story. Helen felt her heart accelerate. How many are there? 217 so far, and the number keeps growing. The women in the room looked at each other, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. It was no longer just a training project, it was transforming into a national movement. But how are we going to ensure quality? Asked Sandra, always practical. How are we going to train all these mentors? That's when Helen's phone rang. It was Edward. I've already thought of that, he said, his voice transmitting enthusiasm. How about transforming the restaurant school into a mentor training center? We can create an intensive program, bringing mentor candidates to spend a few weeks with you and your team. That would cost a fortune, Helen pondered. Money is the least of the problems, Edward responded with a soft laugh. Besides, several companies contacted us wanting to sponsor the project. Your story touched many hearts, Helen. That night, after a long planning meeting, Helen decided to walk home instead of taking her usual bus. She needed to organize her thoughts, digest everything that was happening. She passed in front of an electronics store where several televisions in the window simultaneously showed her interview from the previous day. It was surreal seeing herself on screen, speaking with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. Her phone vibrated, a message from Edward. I passed by the restaurant today after everyone left. The kitchen still holds the echo of that bolero. Helen smiled, typing her response. You should have come in, we could have danced again. The response took a few minutes to arrive. Not yet, but I promise that when the right time comes, it won't be just a dance. It will be a celebration of everything you've accomplished. Helen put away her cell phone, her heart light as a leaf in the wind. Passing by a cafe, she heard the soft notes of Sabre Ami escaping through the windows. She stopped for a moment, closed her eyes and let the music envelop her. An elderly lady sitting on a nearby bench watched her with a knowing smile. Sometimes, she said, life surprises us with the most unexpected melodies, doesn't it? Helen opened her eyes, returning the smile. Yes, she responded, and the most beautiful thing is when we discover that we always had the music inside us. We just needed someone to make us hear it. She continued her way home, but now her steps had a different rhythm, the rhythm of someone who had finally found their own dance in life. The national expansion of the project brought with it a wave of changes that no one had foreseen. The restaurant school now pulsed with different energy, receiving groups of future mentors from all corners of the United States. Helen found herself facing women who had traveled for days, some leaving their cities for the first time, all carrying the same brightness of hope in their eyes. Miss Helen, called a lady from Texas during a practical class, do you think we'll be able to make the same magic happen in our cities? Helen stopped chopping vegetables and looked at the group gathered around her. She saw faces marked by time and experience, hands calloused by hard work, eyes that held stories of struggles and perseverance. The magic, she responded softly, isn't in the place, but in the people. It's in the love we put into each dish, in each gesture, in each teaching. It was during one of these classes that Beatrice hurriedly entered the kitchen, her normally composed face showing unusual agitation. Helen, we need to talk. In private. In the office, Beatrice closed the door and turned on her tablet. On the screen, headlines from various news portals highlighted a story that made Helen's heart freeze. Mitchell Empire in crisis. Rebel heir uses family fortune on controversial social project. Edward Mitchell defies family and invests millions in restaurant school network. Shareholders question use of resources in gastronomic project. The family is filing a lawsuit, Beatrice explained, her voice tense. They claim that Edward doesn't have authority to use company resources this way. They want a complete audit of the project. Helen felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. This means that... No, Beatrice interrupted firmly. Edward is already taking action. He won't allow anything to happen to the project. But he needs to appear publicly. He can't hide anymore. The family is using his seclusion as an argument to question his management capacity. Helen closed her eyes, remembering the last video conference with Edward, how he seemed vulnerable despite his strength. Now she better understood why he stayed in the shadows. What can we do? She asked, determined not to let that dream collapse. Edward is calling a press conference for tomorrow. He wants you to be there, Helen. Actually, Beatrice hesitated. He said he'll only do it if you're by his side. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She stayed on her small balcony, observing the city lights, reviewing in her mind each moment since that first dance. Her phone rang shortly after midnight. Sorry to call so late, Edward's voice sounded tired. I imagine Beatrice already told you everything. Yes, she responded softly. Why didn't you tell me before about the problems with your family? Because I wanted to protect you and the project from all this family drama. But now... He sighed deeply. Helen, you changed my life that night. Not just with the dance, but with your authenticity, your silent strength. Tomorrow, I need to show the world who I really am. And I can only imagine doing that with you by my side. Helen felt silent tears running down her face. I'm afraid, she admitted. Not of facing your family or the press, but that all this might harm our students, their mentors, their dreams. Then we'll fight for them, Edward responded firmly. As you've been doing since day one, as my grandmother would have done. A moment of silence settled between them, filled only by the distant sound of the nocturnal city. Edward? Yes? Tomorrow before the press conference, can we dance again? She could hear the smile in his voice when he responded, I thought you'd never ask. The morning of the press conference dawned with a surprisingly blue sky in New York. Helen arrived at the restaurant school 2 hours before the scheduled time, finding the space already transformed by a press assistance team. Cameras, microphones, and lights had been strategically positioned in the main dining room. Is everything ready? Asked Beatrice, appearing beside her with a cup of coffee. Helen nodded, nervously adjusting the navy blue blazer she had bought especially for the occasion. Her students had insisted on helping her choose the perfect look, elegant but authentic, as Grace had defined it. Has he arrived yet? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. As if in response, the main doors opened. Edward Mitchell entered, wearing an impeccable suit but with an air of simplicity that contrasted with the typical image of a business magnate. His eyes met Helen's immediately. Good morning, he said softly, approaching. I think we have an appointment before all this craziness begins. With a gesture, he signaled to someone near the sound system. The first notes of Saber a Me filled the atmosphere exactly like that first night. Ms. Helen, he extended his hand, his eyes shining with a mixture of tenderness and determination. Would you grant me this dance? The world seemed to disappear when they began dancing. There were no cameras, no family crisis, no worries, just the music, the movement, and that inexplicable connection that had changed their lives. You know, Edward murmured while they danced. I spent years hiding from the world, immersed in family grudges and regrets. Then, on an ordinary night, I saw a cook leave her comfort zone to dance with a stranger. That's when I realized that sometimes we need to take an unexpected step to find our true path. Helen smiled, remembering her own transformation. I never imagined that dance would bring me here. Neither did I, he laughed softly. But now we need to dance to a different song. Are you ready? The music ended, and they separated just as the first journalists began arriving. The room quickly filled with voices and camera flashes. The press conference began promptly at 10. Edward took the microphone with a serene posture that surprised everyone. "Good morning," he began. "Some of you must be wondering why an heir to the Mitchell Group decided to invest millions in a gastronomic training project. Others question my withdrawal from public life in recent years. Today I want to tell the true story behind these decisions." He paused, looking directly at Helen before continuing. "My grandmother was an extraordinary cook who never had the chance to realize her dreams. She taught me that true wealth isn't in bank accounts or stock shares, but in the capacity to transform lives. When I met Helen and saw her silent work in the corner flavor kitchen, I recognized the same passion my grandmother had." Edward then invited Helen to join him. Side by side, they presented the impressive numbers of the project. Hundreds of trained women, dozens of new businesses opened, a national network of mentors in formation. "This isn't just a social project," Helen spoke, her voice firm and clear. "It's a transformation movement. Each woman who passes through our kitchens takes with her not just culinary techniques, but the certainty that it's never too late to start over." When journalists began asking questions, many of them aggressive about the family dispute, it was Edward's turn to show his strength. "My family questions the use of resources, but forgets that companies don't exist just to generate profits. They have a transformative role in society. And if necessary, I'm willing to use my personal inheritance share to keep this project alive." The statement caused a stir in the room. Beatrice, from the back of the room, smiled proudly. After the press conference, when journalists began dispersing, Edward gently held Helen's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For teaching me that sometimes we need to leave the kitchen to make a difference." Helen smiled, lightly squeezing his hand. "And thank you for showing me that. Some dreams just need the right music to begin." The press conference had an even greater impact than expected. In the days that followed, the story of Edward and Helen dominated not only the economic sections, but also the lifestyle and behavior pages. The image of the reclusive heir who found his purpose through a social project, inspired by a dance with a cook, captured the public's imagination. "Look at this," exclaimed Maria, showing her cell phone to Helen during breakfast at the restaurant school. "There are already 3 social media pages dedicated to you two. Followers are calling it the gastronomy fairy tale." Helen blushed slightly, still uncomfortable with all the attention, but there wasn't time to worry about sudden fame. The first national class of mentors was arriving that morning. The main dining room had been transformed into an improvised auditorium. 50 women from different American states, all with unique stories of overcoming obstacles, anxiously awaited the beginning of the intensive training program. "Welcome," Helen began, her voice transmitting confidence that grew each day. "Each of you was chosen not just for your culinary talent, but for your capacity to inspire and transform lives." Among the participants was Mrs. Zelda, a 68-year-old lady from rural Texas, who for 3 decades had maintained a small inn known for its regional food. Her eyes shone with emotion as she listened to Helen speak. "When I saw your story on television," Mrs. Zelda commented during a break, "it was like someone finally understood what I had always felt. That the kitchen isn't just a workplace, it's a space of transformation." The program had been carefully planned to last 3 weeks. Besides advanced culinary techniques, the future mentors would learn about management, teaching psychology and entrepreneurship. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries. It was during one of these classes that Beatrice discreetly entered, the auditorium signaling to Helen. In the hallway, her expression was serious. "The Mitchell family called an extraordinary assembly," she informed in a low voice. "They want to vote for Edward's removal from the group's board of directors." Helen felt her heart tighten. "Does he know?" "Yes." "Actually," Beatrice hesitated, "he's here. He wants to talk to you." Edward was waiting in the small back garden, one of his favorite places in the complex. He seemed tired, but his eyes maintained that determined brightness Helen had learned to admire. "Sorry to appear like this," he said when she approached, But I needed to see you before facing what's coming. Your family won't give up easily, will they? He smiled sadly. No, they never understood my choices. When I stepped away from the company years ago after a series of disagreements about business direction, they thought it was just a phase. Now with the project, with you, he paused, searching for the right words. They realized it's something much bigger. Helen observed the garden around them, the aromatic herbs she herself had planted, the small bench where she sometimes sat to think. What can we do? Fight, Edward responded simply. But this time, I don't want to do it alone. Helen, he turned to face her directly. You changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. You made me believe again in the power of human connections, in the magic of new beginnings. Edward. Let me finish, he asked softly. Tomorrow, at the assembly, I'm going to propose something radical. I want to transform the project into an independent foundation with its own patrimony, and I want you to be not just the executive director, but my partner in all of this. Helen held her breath, understanding the weight of that proposal. It wasn't just a professional matter. It was a declaration of trust, of partnership, of something deeper that both had been quietly building. But what about your family? The group? Sometimes we need to choose between the legacy we inherit and the legacy we want to build, he responded, extending his hand to her as he had done that first night. What do you say? Are you willing to dance this new song with me? Before Helen could respond, they heard applause coming from the garden door. The mentors in training had taken a break from their class and were watching the scene, many with tears in their eyes. Go ahead, Miss Helen, shouted Mrs. Zelda, her voice choked with emotion. Sometimes the best seasoning in life is the courage to take risks. Helen looked at the women who had become her extended family, at the garden that symbolized growth and renewal, and finally at Edward, who waited patiently for her answer. With a smile, she took his hand. You know what? She said, her eyes shining. I think it's more than time we learned some new steps. The morning of the assembly arrived with different energy in the air. The restaurant school was exceptionally quiet. Classes had been suspended, and the mentors in training had organized a special breakfast for Helen before her departure for the meeting. It's our way of saying we're with you, explained Grace, serving coffee prepared with specially roasted beans for the occasion. Each of us contributed something to this table. Helen looked emotionally at the banquet before her. Homemade breads, regional cakes, crystallized fruits, traditional sweets, each item telling a story, each flavor carrying a wish for good luck. I brought this for you, said Mrs. Zelda, handing over a small package. Inside was an old silk scarf, delicately embroidered. It was my grandmother's. She always said it carried luck for important moments. Beatrice arrived punctually at 8:30 a.m., bringing with her a set of documents. Edward spent the entire night finalizing the foundation proposal with lawyers, she explained as they headed to the car. He wants everything to be perfect. During the trip to the Mitchell Group headquarters, Helen observed the city awakening through the car window. New York had a different brightness that morning, as if it too was rooting for them. The company building was an imposing structure of glass and steel that seemed to touch the sky. In the lobby, Edward was waiting for them, elegant in his dark suit, but with that gentle smile Helen so admired. Ready? He asked softly, offering his arm. Like never before, she responded, adjusting Mrs. Zelda's scarf around her neck. The council meeting room was packed. Executives in expensive suits, lawyers with their leather briefcases, and at the center of the table, the Mitchell family, serious faces that carried the weight of generations of power and tradition. Edward, began Richard Mitchell, the family patriarch, his grave voice echoing through the room. Before we officially begin, I'd like to make one last attempt at dialogue. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Edward looked at Helen, then at his father. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The presentation that followed was different from anything that room had ever witnessed. Edward didn't speak just about numbers and projections, although they were impressive. He spoke about social transformation, corporate purpose, true legacy. What I propose, he concluded, is the creation of the Flavors and Dreams Foundation, an independent entity that will continue and expand the work we began. And yes, I'm willing to use my inheritance share to guarantee its sustainability. A murmur ran through the room. Richard Mitchell adjusted himself in his chair, his face a mask of restraint. And what about you, ma'am? He addressed Helen for the first time. What makes you think you can lead a project of this magnitude? Helen felt the weight of all gazes upon her. She touched the scarf around her neck softly and stood up. Mr. Mitchell, she began, her voice clear and firm, I spent 20 years of my life believing that my place was only in the backstage of a kitchen. But I learned that sometimes we need to step beyond our comfort zone to discover our true strength. She paused, looking into the eyes of each person present. This project isn't just about gastronomy, it's about giving voice to those who were never heard, opportunity to those who never had a chance, dignity to those who always worked in the shadows. And if there's something I learned managing a professional kitchen for 2 decades, it's that true leadership isn't about power. It's about service, dedication, and the capacity to make others shine. A deep silence fell over the room. Richard. Mitchell stared fixedly at Helen, his face gradually softening. You know, he said finally, you remind me of someone. Someone who also believed that a kitchen could change the world. Edward held his breath. Dad. Your grandmother would be proud, son, Richard completed, a discreet smile appearing on his lips, not just of the project, but of you having found someone who shares her same vision. The tension in the room began to dissipate. One by one, the council members began showing support for the proposal. When the final vote happened, the result was surprising, unanimous approval. As they left the meeting room, Edward held Helen's hand. I think we deserve a special celebration, he whispered. How about dinner? I know a small neighborhood restaurant that has the best bolero in the city. Helen laughed, feeling her heart light as a feather. Only if you promise to dance with Amici. Always, he responded, his eyes shining with promises of many future dances. The months that followed the Foundation Flavors and Dreams approval were intense and transformative. The small restaurant school had become the center of a silent revolution in American gastronomy. Each week, new success stories arrived from different corners of the country. On a particularly busy morning, Helen found Beatrice waiting in her office with a radiant expression. We need to celebrate, announced the assistant, extending a folder. The first semester numbers just arrived. Helen opened the report and felt her eyes water. More than 1,000 women trained through the Mentor Network, 200. New businesses opened, partnerships with 15 state governments for professional training programs. But that's not all, continued Beatrice, barely containing her excitement. We received a special invitation. UNESCO wants to include our project in the catalogue of best practices in education and female entrepreneurship. Helen let herself fall into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had achieved. Her gaze wandered to the wall where she had framed the first apron she wore at Corner Flavor Restaurant, now a relic that told a transformation story. Miss Helen! Maria burst through the door, breathless. You need to see this. Mrs. Zelda is live on television. They ran to the main dining room, where a large group was already gathered around the TV. On screen, the sympathetic Texan lady proudly presented her new in-school, where she was already training 15 women from the region. All the success we're having here in Texas, said Mrs. Zelda to the reporter, began with a dance that taught us that it's never too late to start over. She doesn't forget that dance, huh? An amused voice sounded behind Helen. It was Edward, who had arrived silently. Helen smiled, feeling the familiar warmth his presence always brought. In recent months, they had developed a partnership that went beyond professional, a natural synchrony, like dancers who perfectly know each other's steps. Speaking of dancing, he continued, I have a surprise for you. But first, I need to show you something. Edward led her to the back garden, which had become their special place for conversations. There a small table was set for an intimate breakfast. "This reminds me of our first morning after the Foundation's approval," Helen commented, recognizing the breads and sweets he always ordered especially for her. "That was exactly the intention," Edward smiled, pulling out a chair for her, "because today marks another beginning." He took from his pocket an elegant envelope, similar to the one he had left at the restaurant so long ago. Inside, there was an invitation to an international gastronomy event in Paris. "The Foundation was invited to present our project at the world's largest chef gathering," he explained, his eyes shining with pride. "And you, my dear dance partner, will be the main speaker." Helen felt her heart accelerate. "Paris? Me? But—" "No buts," Edward gently interrupted. "You are the soul of this project, Helen. Your story inspired thousands of women. Besides," he made a dramatic pause, "I heard the French love a good bolero." Helen laughed, remembering how it all began. "You're not going to make me dance in front of French chefs, are you?" "No," he responded, standing up and extending his hand to her. "But how about we rehearse a little? After all, Paris is the city of love and unexpected dances." As if by magic, the soft notes of Sabre Ami began playing. Maria, of course always attentive to special moments, had turned on the garden sound system. While they danced among the aromatic herbs and flowers, Helen realized that her life had transformed into a unique recipe, a perfect mixture of realized dreams, new challenges, and that special ingredient that only true love can bring. "You know," she murmured against Edward's shoulder, "I think I understood why your grandmother believed so much in the kitchen's power to change the world." "Really?" he asked softly. "Yes, because it's in the kitchen that we learn the most important lesson, that with the right ingredients, in the right measure, and especially with the right love, we can create something extraordinary." Paris received the Brazilian delegation with the typical charm of its spring. The Grand Palais, transformed into a spectacular gastronomic center for the event, gleamed under the April sun. Helen, standing before the imposing building, breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the moment. "Nervous?" asked Edward, lovingly adjusting the musical note brooch he had given her as a good luck present. "A little," she admitted, "but it's a good nervousness, like the one I felt before our first dance." The auditorium was packed, renowned chefs, gastronomic critics, entrepreneurs, and educators from around the world. In the first row, a special group, Mrs. Zelda, Grace, and 5 other mentors from the project, brought as representatives of the hundreds of women who were now part of the Flavors and Dreams network. Helen took the stage under warm applause. Her English flowed smoothly through the simultaneous translation headphones, while she shared not just numbers and results, but stories. Stories of transformation, courage, new beginnings. "Gastronomy," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "isn't just about food. It's about human connections. It's about preserving memories and creating new stories. Each dish we prepare carries within it the power to transform not just palates, but entire lives." Images succeeded each other on the screen behind her. Smiling faces of students and mentors, kitchens in full activity, graduation ceremonies, new businesses being inaugurated. The audience followed in respectful silence, many visibly moved. "But today," Helen continued, "I want to share with you a special recipe, the recipe for transformation. The ingredients are simple: a dream kept for a long time, a pinch of courage, and that magical moment when someone believes in you more than you believe in yourself." Her eyes met Edward's in the audience, and she smiled. Sometimes, this recipe begins with an unexpected dance, sometimes with a gesture of kindness. The important thing is to understand that it's never too late to change the fire temperature, adjust the seasonings, or even start a completely new recipe. When she finished her presentation, the auditorium exploded in applause. Renowned chefs stood up, many with tears in their eyes. A French chef, particularly famous for her toughness, approached the stage to hug Helen. "Vous avez changé ma vision de la cuisine," the chef whispered in her ear. "You changed my vision of cooking." The gala night that followed was a whirlwind of emotions. The Flavors and Dreams Foundation received the maximum prize for social innovation in gastronomy, and several countries expressed interest in replicating the model. But the most special moment happened away from the spotlights. In the small hotel garden, Edward had organized a surprise. Under the stars of Paris, a small orchestra began playing C'est Beau Ami. "I thought we could create one more special memory," he said, leading Helen to a dance. The American mentors present joined them, each with her partner, transforming the garden into a small improvised dance floor. Mrs. Zelda, dancing with a renowned Italian chef, laughed like a girl. "Look at them," Helen whispered, observing her students, now friends and partners, living their own magical moment. In Paris. "Who would have thought we'd get this far?" "I would," Edward responded softly. "Since that first night when I saw you leave your kitchen to dance, I knew I was witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary." Helen rested her head on his shoulder, letting herself be enveloped by the music and the moment. The lights of Paris twinkled in the background, like earthly stars blessing that celebration of realized dreams. "You know what moves me most?" she asked after a moment. "It's knowing that while we're here dancing in Paris, there are hundreds of women in the United States preparing their own moments of transformation. Each one of them now has her own music to dance to." Edward spun her gently, his eyes shining with love and admiration. "And that's the true magic of what we created together, isn't it? It's not just the stories that have already happened, but all those that are yet to come." The music continued, soft and enveloping, cradling not just the couples dancing, but also the dreams floating there. Dreams of all the women who, inspired by a simple dance in a neighborhood restaurant, had found courage to create their own transformation stories. The return to the United States brought with it a wave of news and challenges. The success in Paris had catapulted the project to an international dimension no one had foreseen. The Flavors and Dreams Foundation headquarters transformed into a pilgrimage point for visitors from all corners of the world. "Ms. Helen," Maria burst into the office on a particularly busy morning. "The First Lady of France just confirmed her visit for next month." Helen raised her eyes from the documents she was analyzing, allowing herself a moment of pause. On her office wall, there was now a new photograph, her and Edward dancing in the Paris garden, with the Eiffel Tower shining in the background. "How many international delegations do we have scheduled?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. Beatrice kept meticulous control of each visit. 15 countries by the end of the year, responded Maria, consulting her tablet. "And that's not counting the 3 African governments that want to implement the program in their rural communities." The sound of animated voices coming from the hallway caught both their attention. It was the new class of mentors, now with participants from Latin American countries, arriving for their advanced techniques class. Helen stood up, adjusting her lab coat. She still maintained the habit of wearing one, even when spending the day in administrative meetings. It was her way of remembering her origins, of keeping her feet on the ground. "You know, Maria," she commented, observing the multicultural group gathering in the main kitchen, "sometimes I wonder if all this is real." The young assistant smiled, her eyes shining with admiration. "It's more than real, Ms. Helen. It's a dream that grew beyond the walls of a kitchen." The day went by at an intense pace, between video, conferences with international partners and strategic planning sessions. Helen found a moment to visit the experimental kitchen, where Grace was teaching a class about traditional American dishes. "The secret isn't just in the ingredients," Grace explained to her international students, "but in the story each dish carries, in the emotional memory it awakens." Helen observed with pride how her former student had transformed into an exceptional educator. Grace now coordinated the traditional recipe preservation program, a project that catalogued and kept alive the gastronomic memory of different regions. "Ms. Helen," a familiar voice called her. It was Mary, one of the first students in the program, who now returned as a guest teacher. "I brought a surprise for you." In her hands, a small artisanally bound book. It's the first copy of our collection, Flavors That Transform, stories and recipes from all our graduates. Helen leafed through the pages carefully, recognizing faces and stories. Each recipe came accompanied by a personal account, a transformation journey. Her heart filled with emotion upon finding Mrs. Zelda's photo, now a local celebrity in Texas, teaching young female cooks at her inn school. "I saved the best for last," Mary smiled, indicating the final pages. There she was, Helen, young and serious on her first day at Corner Flavor restaurant, next to a current photo, dancing with Edward in Paris. The page title said, "The Recipe for New Beginnings, How a Bolero Changed the History of American Gastronomy." Helen gently touched the screen, feeling that she was beginning to understand a little more about the mysterious man who had transformed her life. That photo revealed something that headlines and speculation could never capture: the true reason behind that entire project. The first day of class dawned with special energy in the air. Helen had arrived before sunrise, preparing every detail, with the same care she dedicated to her most elaborate dishes. On each counter, a new apron with each student's name embroidered, a special gift she had secretly commissioned. The women began arriving one by one, each carrying not just their bags but decades of postponed dreams. There was Mrs. Josephine, who had been selling cakes at fairs for 30 years, Sandra, who had raised 4 children cooking in family homes, Grace, who had abandoned gastronomy college in the 80s to care for her parents. "Welcome to your new home," Helen began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Here we are not just cooks. We are guardians of memories, creators of moments, artists of flavor." The inaugural class was about much more than culinary techniques. Helen shared some of the recipes she had found on Edward's pen drive, interweaving them with stories of her own journey. The students listened fascinated, recognizing in her words their own dreams and struggles. "Miss Helen," called Grace during a break, "do you really think it's not too late for us?" The silence that followed was dense with expectation. Helen looked at each face present, seeing in them the same fear she had so often felt. "Let me tell you a story," she responded, taking one of the old books Edward had shared. "Do you know Julia Child? She started her career in gastronomy at 37. At 49, she published her first book. At 51, she debuted on television." The women moved closer, absorbing every word. "But we don't need to go that far. Look at me. At 55, I thought my role was to remain backstage invisible. Then a bolero began to play. At that moment, as if by magic, the soft notes of Saber Ami filled the atmosphere. All heads turned to the kitchen door, where Maria was next to the small sound system, smiling. "Life is like a recipe," Helen continued, her voice mixing with the melody. "Sometimes we need to adjust the heat, change the ingredients, start from scratch. But never, never is it too late to create something extraordinary." The afternoon passed in the blink of an eye. The students learned the basic fundamentals of the professional kitchen. But more than that, they began forming bonds among themselves. Stories were shared between cutting vegetables and seasoning sauces. Laughter echoed through the bright corridors. At the end of the day, when everyone had left, Helen found a different envelope on her desk. It wasn't the elegant paper Edward usually used, but rather a set of simple sheets carefully folded. They were letters from the students. Each one had written a few lines about what that first day meant to them. The words overflowed with gratitude, hope, and determination. The last letter, however, made her heart stop for a moment. It was from Grace. "Dear Helen, today I understood that we are not just learning to cook, we are learning to dance with life again. Thank you for showing us that we can still dream." Helen kept the letters along with all the other treasures she had been collecting since that first night of dancing. In her apartment, while preparing tea before sleep, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello," she answered hesitantly. "Helen." Edward's voice sounded clear for the first time without the intermediation of video conferences. "I just wanted to say that you exceeded all my expectations today. My grandmother would be proud." Before she could respond, the line went quiet. Helen stood there holding the phone, a soft smile on her lips. Outside, the city pulsed with its nocturnal energy, but inside her heart, a bolero continued playing softly. The French First Lady's visit became an event that no one at the Flavors and Dreams Foundation would ever forget. What was planned to be a simple protocol visit became an exciting celebration of female strength and gastronomy as an instrument of social transformation. Helen had planned every detail with the same care she dedicated to her most elaborate recipes. The international students prepared typical dishes from their countries, while the Americans presented contemporary reinterpretations of traditional recipes. "C'est magnifique," exclaimed the First Lady, tasting a shrimp bobo prepared by Mrs. Zelda, who had traveled especially from Texas for the event. "Cette passion, cette authenticité." But the most touching moment happened when Helen led the illustrious visitor to see the Hall of Stories, a recently inaugurated space where the walls were covered with photographs and accounts of women who had passed through the program. Each face here, Helen explained, with Beatrice translating, represents a particular revolution, a life that found new meaning through gastronomy. The First Lady stopped before the photograph showing the first class of graduates. "Cette photo," she pointed, moved. "Je peux voir l'espoir dans leurs yeux." "Yes," Helen agreed, understanding the feeling even without speaking French. "It's the brightness of hope, the same I saw in the eyes of each new student who arrived after them." At the end of the visit, the First Lady made a surprise announcement. The French government was interested in establishing an exchange program with the foundation. American female cooks could study in France, while French chefs would come to the United States to learn about the project. "Mais ce n'est pas tout," she continued, a mysterious smile on her lips. Edward, who accompanied everything beside Helen, translated softly, "She wants you to be the guest of honor at the next Lyon Gastronomic Festival." Helen felt the world spin for a moment. Lyon, the gastronomic capital of France, the birthplace of so many culinary traditions. "And there's one more thing," Edward added, his eyes shining. "They want you to dance." "Dance?" Helen asked, confused. "Oui," the First Lady intervened, excited. "Le bolero, l'histoire d'amour, c'est magnifique." Apparently, the story of the dance that had started everything had reached France, capturing the imagination of romantic French people. The festival wanted to recreate the moment, transforming it into a symbol of unity between cultures through gastronomy. That night, after the French committee's departure, the foundation team organized a small celebration in the garden. The space was illuminated by hundreds of small lights, and the aroma of fresh herbs mixed with the soft music playing in the background. "A toast," proposed Grace, raising her glass, "to the woman who taught us that every great transformation begins with a small dance step." Helen blushed, moved. She looked around at the smiling faces surrounding her, her chosen family, built through shared dreams and combined courage. "Actually," she responded, "we should toast each of you, because it's your stories that make this project what it is." Edward approached, gently embracing her waist. "And how about we toast the future, to all the stories we're still going to write together?" As if by magic, although everyone knew it was Maria's always attentive work, the first notes of "C'est bon ami" filled the garden. "Madame," Edward made an exaggerated bow, imitating the French accent, "could you grant me this dance? We need to practice for Lyon, don't we?" Helen laughed, accepting his extended hand. While they danced under the stars, surrounded by those who had become a fundamental part of her life, she thought about how a simple dance had transformed into such a powerful metaphor. "You know," she murmured against Edward's shoulder, "I think I finally understood." "Understood what?" "That sometimes life is like a big kitchen. We can spend years following the same recipes, measuring the same ingredients, maintaining the same temperature. But all it takes is a moment of courage, new seasoning, a change in rhythm, and everything transforms into something extraordinary." Edward spun her gently, their faces illuminated by starlight and the glow of a love that had grown along with their shared dreams. "And you know what's most beautiful?" he responded. "It's that our recipe is far from finished. We still have many flavors to discover, many dances to dance." Around them, other people began dancing too, students, mentors, employees. The Flavors and Dreams Foundation garden transformed into an improvised dance floor where each couple spun to the sound of the bolero that had changed so many lives. And Helen, in the arms of the man who had believed in her dreams before she herself believed, knew she was exactly where she should be, at the center of a story that continued to inspire other stories, in a dance that would never end. The Lion Gastronomic Festival was approaching, and with it, an idea began germinating in Helen's mind. During a meeting with her closest team, she finally shared what she had been planning in recent weeks. "I want to propose something different," she began, looking at the attentive faces around her. "Instead of just Edward and I going, we can transform our participation into something bigger." Beatrice, always practical, already had her tablet in hand. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "I thought about taking a delegation, not just to present the project, but to show its true impact." Helen opened a folder on the table. "I selected 10 extraordinary stories from our students and mentors, women who not only transformed themselves, but are transforming their communities." The idea quickly gained momentum. Mrs. Zelda with her traditional Texan cuisine preservation project, Mary, who had created a network of popular restaurants managed exclusively by women over 50, Grace, whose healthy eating program for public schools had already been adopted in 3 states. "But it doesn't stop there," Helen continued, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "I want each of them to prepare a dish that tells their story, something that represents not just their region or technique, but their personal journey." Edward, who had remained silent until then, smiled. "You want to transform our presentation into a spectacle of stories and flavors?" "Exactly," Helen confirmed. "And at the end, let me guess," Maria interrupted, excited. "Everyone dances." The room exploded in laughter, but the idea had special charm. The dance that had started everything would now multiply into various transformation stories. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. The French embassy, enchanted with the proposal, offered total support. Those selected for the delegation dove into intensive basic French classes, while their recipes were refined and adapted for ingredients available in France. "But how are we going to transport all the special ingredients?" asked Grace during a planning meeting. That's when Richard Mitchell, Edward's father, surprised everyone with an unexpected visit. "I heard about the Lion project," he said, observing the preparations in the experimental kitchen. "And I think the Mitchell group could contribute with logistics. After all, transportation is our specialty." Helen noticed how the businessman's eyes, once so severe, now carried a different brightness when observing the work done there. He stopped before the photo wall, dwelling especially on one showing his late mother, Edward's grandmother, in her own kitchen. "You know," he commented softly, "my mother always said that a family's true wealth isn't in its goods, but in the stories it tells and the lives it touches." Edward, who was beside Helen, discreetly squeezed her hand. It was the first time he saw his father speak of his grandmother with such emotion. "Helen," Richard continued, turning to face her, "when you and Edward started this project, I confess I had my doubts. I thought it was just a romantic dream, maybe even a form of rebellion." He paused, smiling slightly. "I've never been so happy to be wrong." The Mitchell Group's support opened new possibilities. Not only could special ingredients be properly transported, but it was also possible to expand the delegation, including more stories, more flavors, more dreams. One afternoon, while supervising the final rehearsals of the presentations, Helen found a small package on her desk. Inside was an old silk scarf, delicately embroidered with musical notes and a note from Edward. "To wear in Lion, because every great presentation deserves its own magical accessory, like that first scarf from Mrs. Zelda that you wore at the board meeting. This one also carries stories and promises. And speaking of promises, how about we rehearse our dance tonight? The garden is especially beautiful under June stars." Helen smiled, caressing the soft fabric. Through her office window, she could see the movement in the main kitchen, women of different ages, origins, and stories, all united by the same purpose, all part of a transformation that had begun with a simple dance step. "Yes," she whispered to herself, keeping the scarf close to her heart. Some stories deserve to be danced. Under the stars. Lion received the American delegation with all the pomp that France's gastronomic capital could offer. The historic Les Halles de Lyon Paul Bocuse, a centennial market and temple of French gastronomy, had been chosen as the stage for the special presentation of the Flavors and Dreams Foundation. On the morning of the big day, Helen woke before dawn. From her hotel room window, she could see the city lights still on, like earthly stars guiding her path. On the armchair, the scarf gifted by Edward waited to compose her look. "Ready?" Beatrice's voice sounded soft at the door. The assistant had become much more than a collaborator. She was a friend, a confidant, someone who understood the magnitude of what they were about to accomplish. "Almost," Helen responded, adjusting the scarf around her neck. "How are the others?" Anxious but determined, Mrs. Zelda has been in the kitchen since 5 in the morning, preparing her cassava fritters with cheese that she insists on calling petit gâteau from Texas. Helen laughed, imagining the scene. Her girls, as she affectionately called all participants regardless of age, had conquered the hearts of the French team during the last days of preparation. Les Halles began coming to life as the morning progressed. The traditional boxes of local merchants had been transformed into small demonstration stations, each telling a different story of the American project. Madame Hélène, called Chef Antoine, the renowned festival curator, approaching with his characteristic enthusiasm. Les journalistes sont déjà là. The journalists have already arrived. Indeed, a small crowd of international media professionals was gathering at the market entrance. But they weren't just journalists. Helen recognized various famous chefs, gastronomic critics, and even some celebrities who had come to honor the event. The presentation began with Grace telling her story while preparing a contemporary shrimp bobo. Her narrative, simultaneously translated into French, caused visible emotion in the audience. "Cette sauce," murmured a Michelin-starred chef, tasting the dish. "C'est de la magie pure." One by one, the women from the American delegation presented their dishes and stories. Mary surprised everyone with a reinterpretation of cassoulet using American ingredients. Mrs. Zelda earned enthusiastic applause when teaching natural fermentation techniques she had learned from her grandmother. Between one presentation and another, small French folk dance groups performed, creating an atmosphere of cultural celebration. The aroma of different dishes being prepared mixed with the music, transforming Les Halles into a symphony for all senses. Finally, the moment. Everyone awaited arrived. The market lights dimmed softly, and a single spotlight illuminated the center of the space. Helen, wearing the musical scarf gifted by Edward, walked to the illuminated spot. "The story I'm going to tell today," she began in English with simultaneous translation, "isn't just mine. It's the story of all women who, at some moment, needed to find courage to take a new step in their lives." Edward emerged from the shadows, elegant in his dark suit, extending his hand to her exactly as he had done that first night at Corner Flavor restaurant. The notes of Sabre Ami filled the historic atmosphere, but this time something different happened. One by one, her students and mentors joined the dance, each with her partner, transforming the centennial market into a celebration of life and transformation. "C'est magnifique," exclaimed the French First Lady, who had made a point of being présent. "C'est l'essence même de la gastronomie. Unir les gens, créer des moments, transformer des vies." While dancing in Edward's arms, Helen observed the result of everything they had built together. It wasn't just a social project, nor just a gastronomy school. It was a transformation movement that had begun with a simple dance and now touched lives on different continents. "You know what I'm thinking," Edward murmured in her ear. "What? That some recipes are like life. They need time to find the right point, the perfect balance between all ingredients." Helen smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And what's the secret ingredient of our recipe?" "Love," he responded simply. "Love for transformation, for life, for dreams, and especially the love we found in each other." The lights of Les Halles shone like stars above them. while the bolero continued cradling not just their dance, but all the transformation stories that intertwined there in a single extraordinary celebration of life. The success in Lyon was just the beginning of a new phase for the Flavors and Dreams Foundation. Back in the United States, Helen found her desk full of invitations and international partnership proposals, but it was a simple envelope without identification that caught her attention that spring morning. Inside, there was only a card with the elegant handwriting she knew so well. "Meet me at Corner Flavor Restaurant tonight. I have a surprise for you." The old restaurant where everything had begun had been preserved exactly as it was, transformed into a kind of living museum of the project's history. Occasionally, it still served special meals prepared by program students. When Helen arrived, at the agreed time, she found the place completely transformed. Candles softly illuminated the atmosphere, and a familiar aroma filled the air. The same dishes that were on the menu that special night so long ago. "Welcome back," Edward's voice sounded behind her. "I thought we deserved a moment just for us in the place where everything began." Helen smiled, noticing he wore the same type of clothing he used that first night. "Did you plan all this?" "Actually," he smiled, "I had some help." As if on cue, Maria emerged from the kitchen, accompanied by Grace, Mary, Mrs. Zelda, and other women who had become a fundamental part of that story. "We couldn't stay out of this moment," said Grace, her eyes shining with emotion. One by one, they began serving the dishes that had marked their own transformation journeys. Each dish told a story. Each flavor carried a special memory. "But one thing is still missing," Edward commented, making a discreet signal. The first notes of Sabre Ami filled the atmosphere, exactly like that first night. But this time, when Edward extended his hand to Helen, she noticed something different in his gaze. "Helen," he began, his voice soft but firm, "when I entered this restaurant for the first time, I was looking for a place to hide from the world. Instead, I found a reason to live fully again." He paused, taking something from his jacket pocket, a small blue velvet box. "In that first dance, I discovered that some moments have the power to change an entire life's course. And now," he knelt, opening the box to reveal a delicate ring with a small musical note studded with diamonds. "I want to know if you'll accept to dance with me for the rest of our lives." Helen felt the world spin for a moment. Around them, the women who had become her family smiled through tears. "But there's one condition," Edward continued, a mischievous gleam in his eyes. "Our wedding will have to be here at Corner Flavor Restaurant, with all our students preparing the banquet." "As if I could imagine it any other way," Helen responded, her voice choked with emotion. When he placed the ring on her finger, spontaneous applause exploded in the restaurant. Mrs. Zelda was the first to hug them, followed by all the others. "Now yes," the Texan lady declared, wiping away tears. "Our story is complete." "No, Mrs. Zelda," Helen gently corrected, looking at all those extraordinary women who had transformed their lives and the lives of so many others. "Our story is just beginning, because each new student who enters our kitchens, each new dream we help realize, is a new chapter that opens." Edward pulled her closer, and together they began dancing. This time, not just a bolero, but the promise of a shared future. Around them, other people joined the dance, transforming the restaurant into a celebration of love, dreams, and transformation. "You know what moves me most?" Helen whispered in Edward's ear while they danced. "What?" "Thinking about all the dances yet to come, about all the lives we're still going to touch, about all the stories we're still going to help write." Edward smiled, spinning her gently under the soft lights of the restaurant. "And each of these stories began because a courageous cook decided to leave her comfort zone to dance with a stranger." "No," Helen corrected, her eyes shining with love and gratitude. "Each of these stories began because two people discovered that some dreams are too big to be dreamed alone." 1 year later, Corner Flavor Restaurant lived its most beautiful celebration. Helen and Edward's wedding wasn't just a union ceremony between two people. It was a party that celebrated all the transformations that had been born from a simple dance. The space had been decorated with aromatic herbs and edible flowers, cultivated in the foundation's garden. Each table told a different story through its decoration, representing the various regions of the United States where the project had flourished. The former students, now successful businesswomen and chefs, had gathered to prepare the banquet. Each dish was carefully chosen to represent a stage of the couple's journey. The menu was a true journey through the memories they had built together. "Look at this," commented Maria, now the Foundation's communications director, observing the movement in the kitchen. "Who would have thought that first night would bring us here?" Grace, who coordinated the banquet preparation team, smiled while finalizing one of the dishes. "Some recipes are like that. They need the right time to reach perfection." The ceremony was conducted in the garden, where the first yes had been exchanged a year before. Mrs. Zelda, chosen as maid of honor, proudly wore the same scarf she had lent Helen in that first decisive meeting. When the music began playing, it wasn't Sabre or me, not yet. Helen appeared in a simple but elegant dress carrying a bouquet made entirely of aromatic herbs. Around her neck, the musical scarf gifted by Edward in Lion. Richard Mitchell, who was walking the bride, seemed more moved than his own son. "You brought our family back to life," he whispered to Helen before delivering her at the altar. The vows were exchanged amid smiles and tears. Edward spoke about finding his purpose through love. Helen spoke about learning to dance with life. But it was the moment after the ceremony that everyone awaited. The first notes of Sabre or Me filled the air, and the couple began their first dance as husband and wife. This time, however, they weren't alone. Dozens of couples joined them, students, mentors, employees, family members, each carrying their own transformation story. "Look at them," Helen murmured to Edward while they danced. "Each of these women is a miracle in movement." Indeed, it was impossible not to be moved seeing Mrs. Zelda, who now commanded a network of inn-schools in Texas, Mary, whose popular restaurants had become a reference in solidarity economy, Grace, recently named Ambassador of American Gastronomy by UNESCO. The banquet that followed was a celebration of flavors and stories. Each dish came accompanied by a small narrative telling how that recipe had touched someone's life. At the end of the night, when stars were already shining in the sky, Edward and Helen found themselves again in the same place where they had first danced. "You know what moves me most?" he asked, holding her close to his chest. "What?" "Thinking that our story will inspire other people to believe in their own dreams, to take their own dance steps." Helen smiled, observing the movement around them. In the kitchen, a new class of students was preparing to begin their journey. In the garden, couples still danced under the soft lights. In the air, the aroma of hope and possibilities. "And you know what's most beautiful?" she responded. "It's that each new story born here carries a little of our dance, a little of our love." The last notes of the bolero dissipated in the night air, but the music that Helen and Edward had created together, a symphony of transformation, hope, and love, would continue echoing through the lives of all the people who had been touched by their extraordinary journey. Because some stories